This week, we want to start thinking about different approaches to curriculum design. In your textbook, Language Curriculum Design, it lays out three major approaches that you can take. The first is the waterfall. The idea here is that you start filling up the information that you have at a level until you finally have, for example, an entire needs analysis. You know everything about the students and their stakeholders' needs. And then that information basically spills over and starts allowing you to fill up the next stage of decisions, which may be developing goals. As you start to develop the goals and all of that information begins to fill up, it pours over into the content decisions that you're making. The basic idea here is that you're doing one step at a time. You're rarely mixing them together where you're doing multiple things at once. And the waterfall doesn't really focus on a cyclical pattern. Another possible approach is the focused opportunistic approach. This is really a response to time considerations that most teachers who also have to design their own curriculum can't really be doing this waterfall approach every semester, that it would be very unreasonable to expect that. So the basic idea of the focused opportunistic approach is that you've just got to prepare and teach something. And during each iteration, you can really develop one aspect of the course. So maybe in the first time you teach it, you really spend time thinking, well, what are the goals of this course? And you teach it, maybe you develop, very specific goals and you try teaching it. And then maybe in the second one, you think about, well, how did the materials work? Or what should the content and sequencing really be for this course? And each time you get to do it. If you do an approach like this, you might teach the course 3 or 4 times while you're doing the needs analysis before you've finished an entire cycle of curriculum design. One of the weaknesses of this is, especially if you don't have time to do the full needs analysis the first time you teach it, it might show up kind of late. And depending on how generalizable those needs analysis results are, they might not help you plan for future semesters. So it's got some weaknesses. In a sense, I think that a lot of people go through a bit of a layers of necessity. You can think of this as like a hospital triage. In triage, you focus on the most life-threatening injuries. Well, kind of similar to that, in the layers of necessity approach, you think about the big make it or break it type of decisions and make sure that you're addressing each one of those. So for example, in the first time you teach something, maybe you're only looking at like the one major environmental concern that you have. So, oh my gosh, they have chairs bolted to the floors. That's going to impact how I teach. Maybe you make one clear goal that you want to work on. Maybe you do one major assessment to understand students' current skills. You're not doing everything. You're not trying to get the full picture. You're trying to get enough to run it. The next time you run it, your course is already a little bit developed. You've already picked a major goal, right? So you can start to flesh those out. Each time you teach it, then you're adding a little bit more information to what you know about the course and what you want it to be, or what your students need it to be. It's not just about you, right? Okay. One of the interesting things is the waterfall approach is not usually particularly well liked. And I want to come back to that because one of the reasons why it's seen as a concerning approach is that it's just done once. It seems to be too fixed. It's also almost always impossible. So if a teacher is designing something, they almost never have time to spend months designing a curriculum. They usually just have to teach it and learn some things along the way for the next time. So it's a little impractical, but it also gets criticized because it's a fixed order. For example, Flowerdew points out that stages of curriculum design should not be seen as separate and proceeding in a linear fashion. Nation and McAllister points out that the book that you're reading has taken the approach that curriculum design is best viewed as a process, like writing, where the curriculum design could begin at any of several places. In a sense, they're saying the waterfall, even if you do it very carefully, is not enough. However, if we take the waterfall idea further, it's kind of interesting because where does the water go? Right? Eventually, water ends up back at some starting point. Whether that's, well, usually that would be through, right? It evaporates, then it gets rained back down to some place, and then it gets diverted back into a stream, which can lead to another waterfall. So I'm not sure that when people think of the waterfall, that's what they think of, the fact that eventually you might have to do it again. But you could incorporate this waterfall into a bit of a cyclical pattern. But they're usually discussed fairly separately. Graves in 2000 came up with a model of curriculum design, and in a lot of ways it is similar to the types of things that you're talking about in this textbook, and actually the textbook makes an effort to make connections between what you're seeing in this model and the terminology that they're using in their textbook. So for example, where they say defining the context, okay, so let's see. So over here, defining the context. Oh, sorry. That's something like the environment analysis. So the context of learning, the context of teaching, that would be your environment. Obviously, assessing needs is the needs analysis. Articulating beliefs, another way of talking about principles. Formulating goals and objectives, another way of talking about goals. So you see the connection. This isn't that different. One of the things that I like about this chart is it shows that you're kind of working your way in, right? So you might have to define the context and articulate beliefs before you can start doing some of this. But as you start to assess needs, it allows you to formulate goals, develop materials, design an assessment plan, and organize the course. As you begin to conceptualize content or teach content, you might also then assess what has been learned, and it could start the whole thing over again, so you're back at assessing needs. You can go through this, you can move in different orders. You don't have to be constantly going in this like clockwise motion. You could design an assessment plan and then realize you need to develop materials to make sure they're prepared for the assessment plan. So it doesn't have to move in a singular direction. Now, whatever approach you take, you're still going to have to take some stock of where you're starting and where the teacher is starting. And actually, schools and programs can be in very different points regarding the starting location point, whatever you want to call it. One possibility is that you have absolutely nothing. In this case, you would have to create all your materials. Or select a textbook, which would provide some of it, of course, but you have nothing selected, at the beginning. And in some of these cases, you may not be able to buy a textbook. You might work somewhere where textbooks are outside of the budget. You've got to create everything that's going to be used. In the second option, you might have supplementary materials. So you were given, you've just got the class, you're supposed to be designing a curriculum for it. You see what other teachers have been doing as their activities. Maybe you have some copies of some of the supplementary books, maybe not a main textbook. Maybe you have authentic materials in a library or collection that's made available to teachers. So you have things to help you, but you don't really have like a lot of guidance on how those have come together or been used as a whole set. In the third option, you have a course book as well as a curriculum statement. This is actually a really commonplace that instructors at the university level start at. You're handed a course book, and you may probably have a curriculum statement in the form of, a syllabus that another instructor used that lists some of the course goals. Finally, you have a full course book, and one of the differences here between 4 and 3 is that you notice when you look at the course book for number 3 that it's not everything you need for what that course would be. So the fourth option would be you have a full course book that's attempting to teach everything that you would need in that course, and a curriculum statement that's been well developed by another curriculum designer. Okay, so you have all these different options. One of the things that you've got to realize is all of them actually have some advantages, and so all of them have some disadvantages, right? Obviously, in the first option, it's going to be a lot of work, but there's also some advantages there. So one of the things I want you to think about as you get ready to post in the forums for this week is, what are some of the advantages of the different teacher starting points here? And it's going to ask you particularly about comparing options 1 and 4. What are some of the advantages? Okay, so when you're getting started with your needs analysis, you've got to often assess something, something about the needs and students' current levels. But the ways that we've done this historically have been very different. So you can have very different focus in your assessment. So let's go through some of the major focal options for the assessment. So West focused on a target situation analysis. And so what West was most concerned with was, what will learners need to do with the second language in future goal situations? So are they wanting to travel, in which case maybe you're doing things like ordering food or asking for directions? Or are they hoping to get a job, in which case maybe they need to talk about sales and whatever else they might have a job in in a second language. Those tasks that they need to be able to accomplish in the language then often drove the types of courses that you created. So for the traveler, you might have different units on, asking for directions and going out to eat. So it makes a difference what you look at. Another option was the present situation analysis. One of the good things about this is, as part of the needs analysis, they definitely incorporate what students are able to do at the beginning of the course, and then ask, what do they need to be able to do by the end of the course? So it's very much, where are they now and where do they need to get to? However, they do take into consideration aspects of the language teaching environment and personal info about the learners. Holliday advocated for a means analysis. He focused on what resources and materials are available. So that's almost like, what's the teacher's starting point, right? Are there books? Are there supplementary materials? Do the teachers have anything? Has anything already been provided for them? Have there been choices already made? As well as cultural attitudes and expectations. So this is something that's been left out of a lot of needs analysis, and it might be something you want to consider for your own. You don't necessarily have to, but are there any cultural attitudes or expectations that may hinder the success of the curriculum that you're getting ready to design? Now, often we see this when you do drastic changes in the types of cultures that you're designing for. So if you design in the United States, it's often expected that you'll have lots of group work, lots of talking. Well, when you go to a country like China, historically, right, although things change, historically, those classrooms have been very teacher-fronted. So the teacher's up in the front, supposed to know everything, supposed to lecture, and students are supposed to be quite quiet. Well, if you design a curriculum for example, a Chinese classroom, and all of these students and all of these teachers are very used to the teacher lecturing, you're likely to encounter more resistance if you're suddenly throwing them into tons of group work. So you've got to keep in mind if there's differences in the cultural attitudes and expectations, and to what degree your materials, your curriculum, needs to reflect that. Hopefully you're already starting to think about your project. Particularly here, you should be thinking about, oh, well, what could I be doing as my analysis for their needs? What types of things do I need to be including? I want you to think for a moment also about what are some of the potential sources of data, and keep in mind your own project as we kind of move through these basically as we move through anything now in the course, you're kind of keeping in an idea what this course is that you're thinking that you're going to be working on. So, what are some of the possible sources of data for a needs analysis? You have tons. First of all, I would argue that the students have to be included in any needs analysis that you conduct. If you do a needs analysis that does not include the students themselves, you've kind of failed the students. But they're not the only stakeholders, and I've mentioned that before. Other people have a stake in what happens in a classroom. Their parents have a stake, especially if you're dealing with children. These parents want the best education for their children. Obviously, they have a stake in what's happening. The school administration does. Your class reflects on their school, on the quality of their school. They may also have ideas about what good teaching is. They may be, if they're profit-driven, they may be looking for making sure that you're doing a class that's going to bring in students and money. There's lots of things that the school admin could be interested in, and they do hold a stake in what you're doing in your classroom or what the curriculum is that you're designing. If you're designing a curriculum for someone other than just yourself, so for example, maybe you teach 7th grade English language arts, and you're going to create a curriculum for 7th grade English language arts that other teachers are going to have to comply with to get everybody on the same page. That means that you're not designing just for yourself. You've got to think about these other teachers who are going to have to try to attempt whatever curriculum it is that you design. So you've got to keep them in mind. There may also be interest from potential employers. Of course, we can find that out by actually talking to potential employers. However, we don't always even need to go that far. Often through job postings, you can pick up some of the really important skills that students need. You can also talk to experts in the domain that you're going to be teaching. So if you're dealing with English language learners, you can read literature from English language teaching journals. So for example, there's TESOL Quarterly, the Teaching English as a Second Language electronic journal. There's all these different journals. There's textbooks written by applied linguists. Of course, some of the work in this area also comes out of education, so you could be looking in that domain. But looking for people who really know their stuff about what these courses should look like, and using their input as you design. And actually, sorry, I kind of flipped the last two. So if you're looking at books and journals, you'd be looking at the published literature, obviously by domain experts, but you could also talk to the domain experts themselves. So if you have access to perhaps a professor that you think knows their stuff, you could interview them. If you have, I know that in the past I've had people that worked with ESL specialists in their school, so they were not the ESL specialists, they actually had access to one though. Then you could ask them things about the students' needs and their perspective as another stakeholder. Okay, these are all possible sources of data as you do your needs analysis. Now, one thing to keep in mind, I mentioned you pretty much have to do the students because their needs are most important. One question that we should probably consider at this point is, in what ways can a needs analysis that reaches beyond students reinforce or maintain current power structures? In a lot of our teaching of English language learners, we often see very disempowered students. So if you're working with kids, obviously they don't have a lot of power in the classroom. Instead, in their lives, administrators have more control and parents have more control. They don't have a lot of say over their lives. Even when you're dealing with adults, though, you might be dealing with populations that are somewhat that have experienced some loss of power. If they're a migrant population and they don't have legal status in the country, they might be scared. They might not feel that they have power to challenge structures in the country that they're in. even if they're legal residents in a country. However, they may not feel like they have a say in a lot of things, or they know all of the resources that they have to be powerful. So when you think about all of this, in a sense, we have this chance to stand up for our students as curriculum designers. However, it would be silly to say that the school admin or domain experts get no say in what we're doing in our classrooms. I mean, not like the domain experts are going to like hunt you down and check to see what you're doing in your classroom. But to say that we can't just look at what the students say they need or want. Often we need to take into consideration other perspectives. But when we do that, when we say, these ESL students, maybe they're kids, that we want to hear what their parents want, we have said that that counts in a way that takes some of the decision making away from the students. Okay, so it might be important to prevent or minimize this effect. So another question I want you to explore in your forums is, how can we prevent or minimize this effect while using more available data sources to create a more effective needs analysis? So how can we take into account all of these needs and all of these stakeholders while still also making sure we're making the best decisions possible for our students? Obviously, we've got sources of data, but then how can we get the data? All right, we've got students. How do we find out from them what their needs are? Some of the ways that we can collect data: we can actually give them written surveys or questionnaires. Obviously, if you're dealing with little children, this will not work particularly well. However, with adults or even just older children, this could work reasonably well. One thing to keep in mind is, if they're English language learners, to what degree is their English language ability up to the task? Can they answer the questions that you're asking them, especially in their second language? If you don't think they can do it in their second language, can you conduct the survey or questionnaire in their first language? If they're all Spanish speakers and you speak Spanish, you could probably do a questionnaire or survey in Spanish. However, if you have a mixed class, that might rule that out. Okay, so if you have Korean speakers and you don't speak Korean, you're going to have to get more creative. You can also interview. So if you notice that your students feel more comfortable just speaking with you, you could interview. You could even do like a focus group with a class. Interviews are particularly useful also with a lot of the other stakeholders, because it makes it pretty easy on them. You meet with them, you ask them a few questions, and pretty quickly you're done. If you do interviews, I do recommend recording so that you don't have to worry about taking notes, which slows the whole thing down. You can do performance testing. This is particularly useful in figuring out students' actual needs, not just their wants, because it helps identify their current level. So there's lots of different ways that we could do performance testing. We could give them a written grammar test. We could talk to them and make note of their speaking level ability. We could play a recording and ask them to summarize what's on it. We could play a recording and have them answer multiple choice questions. There are so many options for performance testing. I could go on listing them probably all day. I don't want to do that though. However, as you're thinking about how you want to assess your students, you may find it useful to find a chapter or a textbook on assessing. Obviously, we have one in this textbook, but it might not give you exactly what you're looking for as far as identifying current levels. So I would recommend looking up other resources if you're not super familiar with assessments, to develop one that would help you identify students' weaknesses, because you want the assessment to match up with what you're looking for. If you give, for example, if you want to know something in depth about their speaking ability and you give them a multiple choice questionnaire, you probably won't know much about their speaking ability, right? Keep that in mind. Okay. Finally, documents that already exist can often be helpful for not only identifying your starting point, but also collecting information about how other people have approached these things. So course descriptions are useful not only for the current course that you're working on, but also if it's a string of courses, looking at what do they need to accomplish in order to be prepared for those subsequent courses. So getting the course descriptions for courses down the line can be useful as well. And then you don't always have to talk to someone. So if you want to look at employers and what they think their students need, things like job descriptions or postings are often available in newspapers or online forums, and you can do all of that without bothering anyone or waiting on their responses if they don't take the time to respond to you. Okay, now let's imagine you've done all of these things. You've talked to all these people and you've thought about your sources of data. A final thing that you need to think about is ways of enhancing your validity. Validity is a term that often comes out of research methods. And basically, you want to make sure that your results are valid, that you didn't just make them up or have a small piece of data that, influence your results in a way that would be inappropriate. So we want to think about ways of enhancing validity to make sure that we're actually finding, or what we think we find is actually somewhat true. One way to do this is through triangulation. So in triangulation, if you actually think of a triangle coming together, the lines connecting those points, in the same way, conclusions and then your needs analysis would be developed using a range of data sources. So imagine your student being one point of the triangle, maybe the parents one point, and the school admin being one point. And you've got the lines coming together to break it all into one shape. In the same way, right, we can use a various collection of data sources in order to complete this picture of what the needs are for our students. Another option is prolonged engagement. In prolonged engagement, you would basically go observe a class over and over and over again, and you might come back to it over multiple semesters, multiple years, and collect a little bit of data each time. This allows you to confirm things that you found. Maybe you did it in the first semester and you come back the second semester and you look to see if the same ideas hold true. And you come back the third semester, do the same ideas hold true? Are you finding new results? Gives you chances to do it over and over again, really. Another option is participant verification. And in this method, basically, as you start to form ideas for what you think you're seeing, so maybe you conducted a needs analysis with the students and you think they're saying that they want more grammar, for example, or less grammar. Whatever picture you think you start to see emerging, you take it back to whoever you did the original needs analysis with. So the original participants that you talked with, the original administrators, the original domain experts, whoever you got this picture from. You take it back to them and you tell them about what you think you see. And they tell you whether you got it right or not. So they can tell you, well, yeah, maybe I wanted a little bit more grammar, but I don't want that to be the whole class. And so you can actually refine your picture of what you are identifying from your needs analysis through checking it again with those participants. So that is the end of this presentation. As you work in your forums for this week, there's quite a few discussion questions. Don't feel like you have to answer all of them. Try to answer some, and some of your other classmates will be able to join into the conversation and add in their thoughts as well. All right, good luck with all of the rest of the work this week.